introducing our speaker, Robert, who's already with us here. Robert is a professor of South and Southeast Asian art history at George Mason University. He's a specialist in the early history of Buddhism and has conducted fieldwork in India, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia. He's the author of several publications and has co-curated the Encountering the Buddha Art and Practice Across Asia, the exhibition at the Sackler Gallery of the Smithsonian. He's a regular lecturer at the Smithsonian as well, and Robert was awarded a Getty Research Institute Fellowship and is currently a Robert N.H. Ho Family Foundation Research Fellow. We're very excited to tour the cave temples of India with Robert in January. Many of you have actually signed up and we're running full on this trip. We have 4 spots left. So do write in soonest if you'd like to join us, and details are online at www.eyhotours.com. So I will now stop. I'll hand over to Robert. So Robert, you can take it away.
Absolutely. First, I'm getting over a cold. My voice is a little weird today, but I'm just going to power through. I'm very excited to present to you what I'm calling Highlights of the Western Deccan. It's sort of a promotional overview that hopefully provides some of the logic of why we chose the sites that we chose for this upcoming tour. I hope will show that we've chosen sites that are not only geographically proximate, being in the Western Deccan, which is sort of the lower western half of South Asia, but also show examples of art and architecture from almost every major period and almost every major dynasty, from the 2nd century BCE all the way up until the present. And so it's, I think, promises to be a really wonderful tour. We're going to start in Mumbai, which is an amazing city with an ancient legacy. Most of what we see today is either from the colonial period or from very contemporary and modern designs. But the city had been a port since antiquity. And it was where a lot of the wealth from international trade, particularly because of cotton exports from India, and it was that trade network that's going to end up paying for most of the beautiful cave sites that I'll be talking about and showing you over the course of the evening. And in fact, speaking of that, from Mumbai itself, you can easily access 2 really beautiful cave sites. One of them is accessible via these boats because it's out on an island, and the other one is in a nature preserve just outside the city. So let's go first to the island. This is the Elephanta Caves, and these are from about 520 to 600, products of the Kalachuri dynasty. Because I have like a half hour tonight, I'm not going to go into all the details, but obviously on the tour, I will be giving much more extensive descriptions and analysis of the iconography and the images that we'll be seeing in the caves. For now, I'd like to talk just broadly about what an amazing thing rock-cut architecture is. These are temples that are literally carved into the mountains themselves. And as a result, we have an unparalleled historical record. If you build a building, sooner or later, somebody's going to remodel, right? Somebody wants to redo the kitchen or add a new bath or whatever. But built architecture is rarely unchanged over the course of centuries. Rock-cut architecture remains permanent. And in fact, if somebody does want to add something, we can see very clearly where those additions were made because you have to carve deeper back into the stone, right? And so you can tell where that original layer was, and as a result, we have a tremendous historical record. This is the interior of the main Shiva temple at Elephanta Island. What we're looking at here on the right is the main image chamber. That's the Garbhagriha, the womb chamber, where the primary icon is. And the rest of the temple has been carved out as a kind of massive religious space, an active temple on an island out in the middle of the water outside of Mumbai. It's really a magical place. And probably the most striking of all, I should say, there is relief carving over all of the walls. It is a very ornate and gorgeous structure. It has a more troubled recent history. It was given over as a port to the Portuguese for a while, who mistreated it a bit. But we're lucky in that a lot of the sculpture still remains. And probably the most spectacular is this massive three-headed, or actually intended to be originally a five-headed version of Shiva, who is carved as a massive image along the back wall. I put up two images of the same relief, one with a human in it, so you could get a sense of the scale. It's a really awe-inspiring structure. We're seeing the three heads. There's an implied fourth one behind, and then often we get descriptions of an invisible one that looks up, being a fifth above. Also near Mumbai, another cave site. And this one, chronologically, is one of the two oldest sites that we would be looking at. These are the Kanheri caves. They're located in the Rajiv Gandhi Natural Park, which is a beautiful nature preserve outside the very bustling and busy parts of Mumbai. The amount of time it takes to get there depends dramatically on the traffic. But once you get there, you're sort of transported into another location. I have here 1st through 2nd century CE. That's really the heyday of Kanheri. But Kanheri has one of the longest periods of occupation of any of the cave temple sites in South Asia. The earliest caves date to about the 2nd century BCE, and the last caves date all the way into the 10th century. Some say even 11th. So it's a massive period of occupation. And these are Buddhist cave sites. While Elephanta is Hindu, these were occupied by the Buddhists. And they were largely sponsored by the local community living in Mumbai, who had grown wealthy off of trade and agriculture. I'm giving you just a sampler of some of the really beautiful caves. Now, I'm not going to show you all the caves. There's like 105 of them. And so even when one goes there, it's unlikely that we'll visit them all, but there's ways that you can walk around the gallery, and certainly some of the most accessible ones are the ones closest to the entryway. There's also really beautiful water systems. One of the things that is sort of a remarkable feature of these cave sites, and one which I'll be sure to point out as much as possible on the trip, is that the peoples who lived in these caves needed water. They needed to be able to direct, channel, store, preserve water for their own use, and also for the ritual needs of the services that took place there. And Kanheri is one of the most beautiful. It's almost like a water park in the rainy season. It's a very popular date destination for the young people of Mumbai, and it's just a beautiful place to visit. The water sort of drifts between the cave temples, and I shouldn't say they're all cave temples. Many of them are also monastic residences, meaning the caves in which monks, particularly Buddhist monks, would have resided. And so we'll learn the difference between the different types of caves, learn the iconography and the imagery, being able to tell one cave from another, as well as even things like who are some of the major figures. So that's just Mumbai, right? So that's just the start. Now I want to head inland, and I'm going to take us in. If you look at the map, you can see in the light blue area, the caves of Ajanta. Probably the most famous of anything that we're going to visit on this site. The Ajanta caves are a remarkably important site in the history of India. The earliest caves date to the 2nd century BCE, but the later ones were built in the late 5th century. And those are some of the most astounding works of architecture ever created on this planet. It's one of my favorite places. And they're all carved onto one side of a valley in this horseshoe-shaped curve in the river. And so you can see on the outer wall, you might see it details there, cave after cave. There's 29 of them carved along in a strip. And it's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's become more popular than it used to be, but with good reason. Not only is the carving really beautiful, but it's one of the only places, in fact, arguably the best place, to get a sense of what early Indian painting looked like. We have literary descriptions of painting being used in a variety of medium, inside wooden palaces, on paper and other materials, but none of it survives. What we have in Ajanta, however, are some beautifully preserved frescoes, particularly in Cave 1 and in Cave 2. There's a little bit in some of the other caves as well, but those two are really the most spectacular. I'll show you in a second. This is the ground plan. The oldest caves are the ones sort of in the, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but they're in the upper sort of left-hand portion of the screen. Those smaller caves there, those are the 2nd century ones. All the ones the large ones that reach out to the edges, those are the 5th century caves. The water system is spectacular. There was actually a local god who was believed to be the god of the river, this Naga king that you see here. He has his own special shrines at Ajanta, and so we can visit those as well. And if you went just past the Ajanta caves, sort of traveling left on the screen, you would find this beautiful 7-part waterfall, which sort of leads the river down into this horseshoe-shaped ravine. Now, if you look at the cross section of the caves, you'll notice that some of them are sort of low and rectangular, and others are tall and have these sort of dome-shaped tops. The long, thin ones are the monastic residences. Those are called viharas. A vihara is a place where monks dwell. And the domed ones, or the arched ones, they have stupas inside. These are mound-shaped, originally made of brick or stone, but here carved out of the mountain itself, intended to hold relics. Relics being remains of a holy person or a holy object associated with a holy person. And Ajanta has several of these stupa halls and many, many, many viharas. If you looked at the map here, you can see the stupa halls are the ones that have usually an apsidal back with a dot in it. That's the stupa. And the ones that are squares with all the little rooms attached, those are the dormitories. Those are the places where the monks dwelled. Okay, let's look at some details. Let's look at Cave 1. I mentioned Cave 1 is one of the most beautifully painted, so I chose to focus more on this one. Here's the exterior. Imagine making this out of a mountain. We'll talk about technique. We'll talk about how art historians and archaeologists believe that the caves were constructed. In fact, there's been some geologists who've recently weighed in and had some really interesting insights based on the kinds of chisel marks that were made on the stone. Now, from the center of the cave looking to the back, we're seeing the image of the Buddha, right, carved into his own cell at the back. And then on either side, we can see some of the really spectacular paintings. The lower portions of the paintings were destroyed because over the centuries, mud and silt had filled the interior of the caves up to that point. And these are frescoes. They're paint on plaster. And if it gets too damp, the plaster disintegrates. And so that's what destroyed the lower portions. But here are some of the spectacular paintings. Most of these they're all Buddhist imagery. Most of them are actually stories about the Buddha's past lives. And so I think one of the fun things we can do, maybe not in the caves where it can be a little bit crowded and we want to cycle through pretty quickly, but certainly in the lectures before, we can go through many of the stories and try to identify them when we're in the caves. Easier sometimes to see them also on images, so we'll make sure we provide those. This is the Buddha from the back of the hall, looking regal and spectacular, counting on his fingers, doing the first sermon. We'll talk about iconography. And again, remember how I said earlier you can tell when things are added? Can you see all of these Buddha images that have been carved on the exterior and they're deeper into the wall? Those are what we call intrusive images. They were ones that were added well after the cave was finished. So one of the sort of fun games that you can play, or one of the ways that you can test yourself in your own eye, is to try and determine what we think is original to the cave and what we think was added later. And in fact, there's a lot of information that's been written about that, which we can talk about. Okay. This is what the interior of a stupa cave looks like. That domed sort of structure at the back, that is a stupa intended to hold a relic, ideally of the Buddha, but because there's only so much Buddha to go around, sometimes it's important monks, sometimes it's other important religious figures whose ashes get placed in them. So while we're in the region too, I'm just going to point out very quickly that on the way to Ajanta, you pass the Laudabad fort. Here we're jumping into the medieval period and even into the Mughal period. This was one of the most impregnable forts in all of South Asian history. It had a reputation for being this, mighty stalwart fortress that couldn't be breached. And it wasn't until the Mughals that they actually managed to take the fort through hostility, and that was through the use of gunpowder. Not just for cannons, but also for blowing up the wall. So again, just to show you that while rock cut architecture is certainly at the forefront, we are going to be looking at other structures as well on the way, including built architecture. So Laudabad's a little of both. If you look at the mountain, you might notice that it has these sheer cliffs on the bottom of it. That's because they were carved. The palace was up top, and any approach to it was made into a sheer cliff by literally carving away the sides of the mountain. So even though it's a built structure, it still has rock cut elements to it. Okay, so near Ajanta is the caves of Ellora, slightly later, and representing 3 different religions. We have Buddhist, we have Hindu, and we have Jain caves. They're a spectacular collection of structures with water systems as well, spread out over a much wider area. There's a lot of them that I could show you. I think there's something like 34, 35 of them. I'm just going to show you a couple. First of all, it's a pleasant walk to reach from one to the other. But as we go, you'll notice that not only are the rock-cut caves carved into the stone, in some cases, the stone is removed around the structure, allowing the structure to stand almost like a massive sculpture in the hollow created by the carvers. And in the Chota Kailash, or the small Kailash, we see a Jain example of one that's a rather modest one. Here we can see it. It's dramatic nonetheless. Right, isn't that beautiful? All of the layers of decoration and carving. We'll talk about Jainism. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between Jainism and Buddhism and Hinduism. And then we have the Indra Sabha, there's a beautiful interior cave. The Jinnah figures that you're seeing here, Jinnahs always appear in one of 2 positions. They're either seated in meditation or standing in a very distinctive meditative style that you can see here. And they're naked because the Jain monks renounce, at least in some of the traditions, renounce everything, including clothing. These are what is known as the Digambara, or the sky-clad monks of Jainism. And so we're going to learn to recognize figures like Parshvanath and Bahubali and others that we can see here. And we'll talk about the stories behind them. There's no shortage of things to discuss. And again, we'll also marvel at the rock cut architecture. This is, again, one of the Jain pavilions. You can see it here. If you look at the circular medallions, you'll notice the lower one has a figure standing in that kind of meditative pose, and the other one has a figure seated in a meditative pose. Those are 2 of the Jinnahs. The Jinnah is the Jain. It's like the Jinnah is to Jainism like what a Buddha is to Buddhism. An enlightened teacher, one who shows the way towards the transcendent state. And so we're going to have lots of time to look at these beautiful examples. And for all of the glories of this particular structure, it is actually the small one. Because the big one, by the way, here's painting too. The big one is this one, the Kailasha temple, the Kailashanath. It is a massive, full-size, 2-story Hindu temple carved out of a single piece of stone. Right? It is literally sculpted out of the mountain. It is, no matter how many times I tell people about this monument, it still is mind-boggling to me. The engineering and planning and labor and effort that went into it. So odds are we will not be standing in this position. This is way up on the edge of the sheer cliff. My vertigo would not want to take us here. If you're intrepid, I won't stop you, but it might be wise to stay at ground level. You get a good view of it, though, from here. You can see how this temple rises with the mountain. And in fact, the name of the temple, Kailashana, or Lord of Kailash, Shiva, the god Shiva, lives on Mount Kailash. And so here the temple, which emulates a mountain, the mountain home of the god, is carved literally out of a mountain. And so there's a wonderful kind of poetic resonance with the physical mountain. The temple is a metaphor of a mountain. The mountain is as the home of the gods, and the name of the mountain, which is named after that sacred mountain. And it's a spectacular structure. As you can see, looking at it, these are 2 stories. There's an exterior pillar or stamba, the entire thing carved out of one piece of stone. And the sort of frustrating part is we're still not sure exactly who did it. We're not exactly sure who the commissioner was, or the person who commissioned it. There's 2 possibilities. Danti Durga is the older one. There is an inscription at the site that Danti Durga mentions himself, but he mentions that he and his troops stayed here. We know this site was sacred prior to the construction of the temple. Yet in the inscription, he doesn't take credit for building this temple. So was it here at the time he was here? Or was he just leaving the inscription mentioning that he had visited a sacred site because this area was sacred to Shiva before the temple was made? Scholars are actually in disagreement about that. Now, there's another possibility, and this is the figure of Krishna I, who lived sort of a generation after Danti Durga. And in this case, the inscription's not at the site, but it's nearby on, I think, a copper plate. And in it, in sort of the many glories that he's accomplished and all of the things that it sort of eulogizes him in a lot of ways, it says that he made a temple so grand that when the gods flew over in their chariots, even they would pause to look at it. That kind of sounds like this, right? I mean, it sounds like something that would draw the attention of everyone, including the gods. And so some people think that probably Krishna I was the one who was primarily responsible for it. But it's very unusual in that we don't get a clear dedicatory inscription at a site, particularly for one this grand. So we can go into detail and talk about the history of the site and of the region, as well as the sort of larger Rashtrakuta dynasty, who we'll be revisiting again. And we'll spend a lot of time looking at the layout, looking at the iconography of the site. I hope you all know what I mean by iconography. I mean the how we recognize various figures. So how do we know when we're looking at Shiva? How do we know when we're looking at Vishnu? How do we know when we're looking at Durga or some other figure? And also we'll consider the layout of the entire temple complex. We can also talk about architectural techniques, because what we're going to find is that there are, this trip will visit a lot of really important Western temples, and we can look at differences in architectural style. 2 of the most common are what are called the sort of the northern style and the southern style of temple. One of the things that's coming out in modern scholarship, and one thing which I think these temples in particular are wonderful at demonstrating, is how no single temple is purely northern or purely southern. That in fact, they mix and match many of those qualities throughout. Okay, so from here, we're going to now travel further south into Karnataka, and we're going to go to the site of Badami. Badami is a 6th through 8th century site, part of the Chalukyan dynasty. And Badami is rock cut, but it's very close to 2 incredibly important built temple sites, Paradakal and Aikole. One is about 10 kilometers away and one's like about 20 kilometers away. So they're all sort of in a very proximate region, and they're all spectacular. One of the things that's kind of neat about it is the first thing we notice is that the stone is different. It's this beautiful reddish stone. In fact, one of the ancient names for Paradakal was Raktapura, or Red City, because the stone was so red. There is a beautiful reservoir. This is a man-made reservoir that sits at the foot of these hills. And there's beautiful tree shrines that are still in worship at nearby the banks of the waterways. Okay, so if you look at the side of the mountain, you'll see where the temple complexes have been carved in. It's a little bit of a staircase up and down to get to them, but it's worth it, because the carving is absolutely beautiful. It's very, very ornately carved and very deeply carved. At this period, the sculptors are clearly getting more comfortable with trusting the stone, carving deeply into the stone, and making these beautiful images, like this image here of Vishnu seated on a naga. The naga is the multi-headed serpent that he's sitting on. His name's Sesha. And there's also temples of structures dedicated to various Hindu deities. This is one dedicated to Shiva. Badami is also beautifully manicured. They take exquisite care of it. So you see all the beautiful sort of landscaping around it as well. It makes the trip even more special. Here's the image of Nandi. This is the bull that is the vehicle that Shiva rides, his trusted friend and companion. And he's looking straight into the temple. And in the far back, you can see the main image, which is the Shiva lingam. And we'll talk about lingams and other kinds of forms of Shiva in more detail, or I can answer questions if you have them. Okay. Like at Elephanta, the walls are decorated with beautiful carvings of various scenes of the gods, including this one here of the dancing Shiva. You're probably familiar with the Chola bronzes of the dancing Shiva. This is a version of that. It's one that predates the Chola bronzes with that circular ring of fire, but it's a gorgeous image. And this is the quality of the kinds of carvings that we'll see throughout Badami. And in fact, I think the artists knew how good they were. There's a poetic form in Sanskrit called Slesha. And Slesha is hard to define in English, but it's a kind of clever pun where a word can have two meanings, and that in the way the sentence is constructed, both meanings apply. So it's a kind of sly and subtle way to make a joke or add a double meaning. And it was considered one of the most sort of refined courtly art forms. And I can't help but think that that's what's going on here. That our, excuse me, that our artists here are punning, because if you look at this sculpture that I've highlighted, you can see that it's either an elephant or a bull. But if you look at where their heads meet, they're both simultaneously. You can trace the trunk of the elephant over the hump of the bull, or alternately, you can trace the hump of the bull and the head of the bull up into the upper part of the elephant's head. And so the artist is cleverly showing us two animals with one head as a way to sort of show off a little. And I love these little artistic flourishes. There's a few of these at Ajunta as well, which I'll be sure to point out. Wow. I hadn't realized my voice was getting so bad. All right. Let's go to Patatakal. Nearby, this is was the sacred site for coronations by the Chalukyan Empire. It was, the name Patatakal means this coronation stone. It was the place where you went when you became king. And as a result, there's a host of temples that were built here, being an incredibly important sacred center. And it has an amazing array, a variety of temples. None of them is huge, but they're all beautifully, beautifully sculpted. You can see just a sample of them here. Very close together, this formed a sort of sacred temple complex that was very closely associated with the Chalukyan court. As I mentioned before, it was called Raktapur, or the Red City, because of that red-colored rock. And you can see the tower shapes vary. We're going to use this to talk about differences between northern and southern style of architectural elements. We can also talk about how temples work within Hinduism. There's, I think, at least one Jain temple here, too. Nearby is one of my favorite sites, and that's the site of Aihole. And Aihole is another one of these temple complexes sponsored by Chalukyan kings. It's a little later. It overlaps with the others a bit, but it has a longer history. The one with the curved back that you see there is a Shakta temple. It's dedicated to the goddess Durga, and it's one of the more distinctive of the temples. It's one of the few to have that curved back, which actually resembles the shape of Buddhist sites more typically than Hindu ones. So we could be looking at an interesting kind of hybrid or inspiration taken from one tradition to the next. Now, there's an immense array of designs. The iconography here can be quite complex. Many of them draw on the epics. If you're familiar with the Hindu epics, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, or even things like the Gita Govinda, which feature Krishna, those kinds of narrative scenes show up here in great detail. And so we can puzzle out some of the details. It's a site that I have visited only once, and I'm eager to go back and see more. So it'll be, I think, an enjoyable experience to spend some time exploring the temples together. Okay. All right. Vijayanagar. Vijayanagar is, so we're moving chronologically too, by the way. So we've moved from the 2nd century up through the 6th through 8th, and now then we went up to the 10th century. We're still in the same region as the others. We're still in Karnataka, but now we're moving to a region known as Hampi, near the city of Hampi. And it's the capital of the ancient kingdom of Vijayanagar. And Vijayanagar was a long-lasting, powerful empire to the south that overlapped chronologically with what was going on with periods of the Mughal dynasty further to the north. So they were at odds with one another. But Vijayanagar is sort of characterized by a very wealthy connection of trades, but also a very culturally astute and accepting court culture. It was a place where differences were often celebrated rather than punished. And we can see that not just in the history of the region and the way it's described. We have foreign travelers coming from places like Portugal and Afghanistan, describing it as like one of the most beautiful places they'd ever seen. But also, well, anyway, why don't I just show it to you and we can talk about it more. This is part of Hampi. What remains are the temple complexes, some of the royal buildings, and the marketplace. So wonderful things to explore. Tucked away into the valleys and the large boulders, we see things like the Shiva Virupaksha temple. This was a major temple for the Vijayanagar Empire. It was expanded under several kings. Krishnadeva, I think, is the one that expanded it the most. Added the massive Gopuram, the gateways that lead into the temple complex, and honor this sacred site that actually had predated the empire by quite a lot. Today, it's still in worship, and it still stands as a beautiful site right on the edge of the river. It's in part of the river where the which had a sacred significance. There's connections here to other parts of South Asia, and trade networks that stretched all the way out across both East and West, reaching, across 3 continents. There's a beautiful Krishna temple as well, a little bit smaller, beautiful carving. Again, lots of narrative relief sculpture here, including the epics. This really fanciful little shrine to Garuda. It's shaped like a chariot or a cart. This is the kind of wooden float that would have been used in temple processions to parade images out into the public on festival occasions. But here it's been entirely carved out of stone. And so it's a way to sort of show the cleverness of the carving to create what would have been a wooden vehicle for the god here out of stone. And it houses an image of Garuda, who's the half-man, half-bird vehicle associated with the god Vishnu. Speaking of Vishnu, not only is this dedicated to Krishna, who's one of the avatars or physical incarnations of the god Vishnu, but we also see other images associated with those avatars. So Vishnu, whenever the world is in danger, whenever there's trouble in the world, Vishnu takes on a physical form and he comes to the rescue. Sometimes he does that as a human or human form, like in the form of Krishna. Sometimes he's an animal, and sometimes he's half human, half animal, like in the form here of the lion-headed Narasimha, where he's looking rather fierce with his eyes. In this case, the face that we see is actually based off wooden mask designs that were used in local dances. And so there's actually connections here between the sculpted arts and the performing arts seen in the single image. Now, one of my favorite features at Vijayanagar and Hampi in general is the hybrid architectural forms. I mentioned that this was a place of trade and contact. We're told that the rulers were incredibly savvy culturally, and they in fact welcomed people of different faiths into their court as long as they were loyal. And in fact, we'll see a lot of Islamic influence here, even though the court is Hindu, in the architectural form, like these beautiful lobed arches that combine the sort of pointed arches of Islam with the lobed decorations associated with Hinduism into a single hall. You can see details here. Now, we're told that the kings, there's actually an inscription of them that they were sultans among Hindu kings, using both titles. There's a really interesting article by Philip Wagner that talks about how the kings of Vijayanagar would change their outfit depending who they had their meeting with, right? So if they were meeting with Hindu rulers, they would wear traditional Hindu garb. If they were meeting with Europeans, they might dress in something that was more European. Or if they were meeting with representatives from the Islamic Mughal court or others, they might dress in things that were more associated with Mughal court tradition. And so they're sort of savvy cultural in maneuvering between those cultural spaces. And in fact, one of their chief generals was Muslim, Ahmad Khan. And here we can see his mausoleum. So a fascinating place. Now, to my mind, one of the most magical and unusual features here are the elephant stables. The elephants had been a feature of both the pageantry and warfare in South Asian kingdoms for centuries and centuries and centuries, since at least the 3rd century BCE. But here we see the arch and dome imported from sort of Islamic architectural traditions being utilized to span the large spaces necessary for these stables, places to comfortably house the royal elephants. And it's right in front of a massive open parade ground that would have been used to practice maneuvers, both those useful for like the pageantry of a parade or a darbar, but also a place where they could practice military maneuvers. And that in the middle, you'll see that raised platform. That's where people could observe the movement of the elephants, and the drummers could signal the sounds that would indicate changes in behavior or new formations that were being used. Here's another view. Okay, and the Queen's Bath. I had just a few more. Now, this is a little bit interesting too. It's a step well. Step wells are amazing structures that draw on groundwater, but because the rains can dramatically heighten or lower the water table, these large sort of underground pyramids are designed in such a way that no matter how low the water table goes, there's always a staircase that leads down to it. And they can be just beautiful to look at, and they're sort of simple and elegant. Some of them can be quite ornate, but the ones here have this kind of stark geometry to them that I always find very appealing. Okay, so this is the Virupaksha temple in the distance. Then you see that long processional path, and down at the end of the path, closest to us, that's the marketplace. This is amazing. We don't have freestanding markets from South Asia in existence because most of them were quite logically made out of wood, and that decays. But here we have the stone stalls that form the backbones of what was an immense mall, like a giant marketplace. And we have literary descriptions that describe the kinds of splendors and wonders that travelers from abroad marveling at the variety of foods, the variety of smells, of rich materials, all of which were present in this marketplace. And so we'll do our best to sort of conjure up those historical memories of the space as we walk through it. How am I doing for time? Oh, I think I'm running low on time. Okay, I'll wrap it up soon. From here then, so okay, also chronologically now we're moving into the later medieval period, and Vijayanagar lasts quite a long time. Eventually the Mughals defeat the kings, but then eventually what we're going to go to is we're going to take a plane back up closer to Mumbai, and we're going to end up in Goa. And Goa is a beautiful port city, so if you're tired of looking at historical things, you can look at waves for a while. But if you're not tired of looking at historical things, it also is an amazing place to study the early colonial period. It was a Portuguese trading city, and it still has the Portuguese architecture, the Portuguese churches, and other kinds of elements that are one of a handful of places in South Asia that still have this kind of architectural form in existence. And so it's a lovely place. I imagine some people will be staying on here longer, but for those of us who have to get back to things, the next step will then take us back to Mumbai. And so we kind of cycle back around to where we started. I intentionally wanted to end with this image again, which I started with, because we see in it the Gateway of India. This was an important site because not only was it built to mark the first British royal visit to India, it's also the last point through which British troops left South Asia after independence. And so again, it marks the end of that colonial period, beautiful example of Indo-Saracenic architecture, and it's right next door to the Taj Mahal Hotel and other kinds of very modern places. So we've kind of made it full circuit, starting in the 1st century BCE, hitting all of the major dynasties and centuries as we've made the circuit through Western India, back to it, and getting a really an amazing look at particularly rock-cut architecture, which is quite challenging to visit on your own, but is, I think, for me anyway, once you get a taste of it, you get addicted to it because there's such beautiful spaces. Anyway, how am I doing? I think I'm just at a half hour. So I'm going to wrap it up here, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions if people have them.
Okay, that's amazing. That's just taking us all the way through this, how many centuries of history that will be, I can't wait, Robert. I really can't wait. I should add one more thing that we're going to cover in Mumbai. We're going to cover the Art Deco site, which is also a UNESCO heritage site. And yeah, so that was around the period of pre-colonial, before the British left, and then kind of spanning into modern times as well. And it's actually the second largest Art Deco site in the world, apparently, after Miami. So we're going to get, we're going to get this architectural society that's looking after the Art Deco site. Give us a talk on that. And I should also mention that for this tour, Robert will be giving lectures throughout, like the day before we're heading to a site. He'll be lecturing, giving us an overview, and hopefully Robert, your voice will be better, and you've struggled on. Thank you so much.
No, I'm sorry you all had to listen to that. That had to be a little bit unpleasant.
No, that's you. I mean,
my croaking through that.
We're grateful to you for just struggling on. So yeah, so that's the tour. Now we'll just quickly take a look at the itinerary. Robert, do you want to call up?
I'll do that. Yep, absolutely, I can do that.
Yeah, I've been having a problem with screen share lately, and as I was saying,
I'll turn the pages as you direct me, Sheila.
Yeah. So this is the itinerary, and as you can see, I like to add a little tagline and say, I want to see the real India, Passage to India, the E.M. Forster book, Passage to India, and he says, I want to see the real India. Well, many of you have been to see the Taj Mahal and the Golden Triangle and so on. Well, this is really going to take you into the real India, back in time, into off the beaten track India. And so this is what the tour is all about. And the reason why we're going with somebody like Robert is because of his enormous storehouse of knowledge on all of these monuments that he's researched and written about. So the deep kind of understanding of what we're looking at. So just generally, if you just want to flip,
Yep.
Robert, just want to kind of
How's
go.
that?
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at, as we saw, Ajanta Ellora, Badami, Aihole. We're going to look at Daulatabad, Hampi, Old Goa, Kanheri, Art Deco, and then we're also actually going to go to
Oh,
Nashik, which is again
good.
another breather in the middle of this. So the way we've structured this tour is that we get like a shot of history, and then we're going to go into the wineries at Nashik, which will just give everybody a real chance to just kind of relax and take in more green, and then we're back again. So it's taken us, Robert and me, actually a while to kind of put the whole thing together. So it's not an overload. You're not gonna, and I personally, I could never get enough of what Robert, talks about. But we just want to make sure that when you're on these sites, it doesn't get to be too much. So we're leaving time to process. We're putting in things that are like, okay, let's take a breather and just kind of step back and see what about. So yeah, and as I said, 5 lectures by Robert as well on this trip. So some of you who have been throughout the pandemic, Robert has been lecturing on a number of topics. And let me tell you, this is just the start, because then we're going to drag Robert all the way to Indonesia and Bagan, and I hope Myanmar, kind of, we can go to Bagan at some point. And so we're going to kind of drag you all over places that you've been talking to us about during the pandemic. But anyway, this is just the start. So maybe you just want to flip
Yeah, absolutely.
next
There you
few,
go.
yeah, and here's Robert. So at a glance, this tour, as you can see on the bottom left hand, I've got a little map there, which Robert was very conveniently showing on this. But we've got 4 nights in Mumbai. We got a night in Nashik. That's where the vineyards are, and then 2 nights in Aurangabad. We've got the 1 night in Badami, 3 nights in Hampi, because it is a huge site and you don't want to rush this. And then we've got 2 nights in Old Goa, which you can all stay on for. I think the price has gone up a little, because this was like a couple of years ago when we looked at this. But anyway, you'll find all the details on the website, which is eyhotours.com. And Robert, if you want to just flip to the next few pages, I think now it's just the itinerary that we spoke about. Yeah, so this is pretty much day by day. It's up on the website, and
I think the dates might be a little different. This one,
the
right?
dates are different. Yes, I have to rework this. I will get the reworked itinerary back up on the website and update this. But yeah, so just generally, we're starting on the 6th of January, and actually, it does say 6th of January, but we're ending on the 19th of January. Yeah, so it's still the same number of days. And of course, where we're staying is always, as you know, with us, with EYHO, we're not never want to make the accommodations kind of an afterthought. So everywhere we've staying at very ambient properties. In Hampi, we're staying at the Boulders Resort, which is beautiful, beautiful, right on the river, and so that you can come back from a hot, dusty day, and you can relax. So pretty much everything is included. A few meals aren't included, but pretty much everything except your international airfare. Otherwise, all the internal flights are included, and there's this whole range of things that are also included. All the guided sightseeing, all of that is all included. Um, Okay, so we are almost, like I said, we can't take a lot of people on this tour, just because you're accessing these sites, and we don't want like 18 people or 16 people. So we're capping this, and so we're now got only I think as of yesterday about 4 spots left. So yeah, so if you're interested, please write to me. If there's any questions at this point, we'll be happy to take these questions. And at this point, if you'd like to start your video and unmute yourselves, you can go ahead. And Robert, you can stop screen sharing if you.
Okay. Yeah, happily.